Alrighty, I'm going to be talking about the cannon and its use in Europe in the Middle Ages. So, introduction to the cannon in Europe. Cannons started popping up in Europe during the late Middle Ages. At first, they were built in a way that was not very sophisticated compared to a cannon you may think of today. They at first did not see a lot of use on the battlefield, but this changed over time as their design changed to better fit the needs of those wielding them on the battlefield. They had an enormous impact on how battles were fought and how castles or fortresses were defeated. The earliest European depiction of a cannon appears in Walter de Milmetti's manuscript from 1326. You can see it right here. You can see the vase-shaped cannon that is made out of metal shooting an arrow because that's what projectile they used at the time. This version that you see here is the version that was used by both the French and the English during the 100-year war, sorry. During which the first battle, when the cannon saw its first actual use in battle, was in the Battle of Crécy in 1346. And here, the weapons were not used as they were intended. They were instead used psychologically to damage their opponents instead of physically. They were not a great weapon to use at the time, so instead they use it how they could. And now we'll take a look at how this invention shook up Europe. So before the cannons, there was medieval siege warfare. And before cannons showed up, most battles, especially sieges, relied on traditional weapons like catapults, trebuchets, battering rams, which is this piece right here in the middle, and siege towers. So catapults, they allowed their users to launch things into the air, but really had no actual way to aim where the objects landed. Trebuchets worked better to aim at their enemies, but they were hard to build and to operate. Battering rams required that those using them got close enough to the wall that they were trying to knock down, and this meant that the enemy could easily stop them by blocking or trapping the ram or by killing those who were carrying it in the close range that they were in. Siege towers over here were great for surprise attacks, but they were not easy to defend. They could be burned easily, and again, the people could be attacked because they were in close range. Castles were incredibly hard to take down with the weapons available, since they were all the walls of the castles were made of thick stone that trying to starve out the defender using these methods. The arrival of gunpowder. So the narrative of warfare changes significantly when gunpowder arrives in Europe. It was first invented in China, but it made its way to Europe around the 1200s or 1300s, probably through trade routes or even battles in the Middle East. Once Europeans started experimenting with it, outside of just using it for fireworks, which is how China and Europe used it in the beginning, they realized it could be used for weapons and they made fire arrows and then they got into building cannons. The early recipes for gunpowder was using sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter to make cannons. The cannons. The first cannons in Europe appeared in the early 14th century. One of the earliest recorded uses was at the Battle of Crécy in 1346, where the English used a few primitive cannon-like weapons. These early models were made of iron or bronze, and they weren't very reliable due to how they were built. Sometimes they blew up in the face of the person handling it. Even though they did not work all that great in the way that they were intended, they did work well to terrify their enemies, which they had never seen or heard these weapons in action before. The loud explosions would cause panic among enemy troops. The sounds were intimidating to both the soldiers and civilians alike. Sometimes these even led to quicker surrenders from the enemy side due to the fear of the noise. They could mainly be used as a scare tactic, even when ineffective for physical attacks. So better for psychological over physical. And this is a reconstruction of a cannon at the time and what it would have looked like. Cannon types. There are a few different types of cannons by the end of the Middle Ages. The bombard, which is this one over here on the top, was a huge cannon used to break through castle walls. It was slow to load, to move, but it was incredibly powerful and it got the job done. They were made to break down walls. They used large stones to hurl at them, and they were made of iron. Then there were smaller versions like the hand cannons, which were early personal firearms, and culverins, which were long and more accurate cannons. Both of them were mostly metal, but hand cannons were occasionally made out of wood, and both of them used metal bullets like that use lead or other metals. All these cannons used gunpowder, even though all of them had different roles depending on the battle they were fighting in. Like you wouldn't want to bring a hand cannon to break down a wall. Siege warfare transformed. So the biggest effect of cannons was how they changed the way that siege warfare was fought. The stone walls that had protected castles for centuries would now be blown apart from distance. This allowed the forces to advance into the castles and fortresses easily. Attacking armies no longer needed months to wear down defenders. They could break walls in only a few days or even weeks. This forced kingdoms to rethink how they built fortresses to better withstand the attacks of the cannon. So this is what a castle would have looked like before they changed it to better withstand the cannons. The walls were straight, they had tall towers. The impact. Cannons didn't just change battles, they shifted power in society. Castles alone were no longer enough to protect the nobles and the kings who were living in them. So fortresses had to have a redesign to be able to defend against the cannon better. This included the way that the walls were built, the shape of the fort, and even the way that moats were used. Yetikul over here, which is the oldest known star-shaped fortification. That's the style that they ended up designing. It was the best to defend against cannons because of the way that they structured the walls. They were stronger, but also the shape of them allowed for them to defend more easily as they could have multiple people looking at the same area of land in different directions and be able to attack enemies better. This also meant that there were less areas unguarded. They began to rely more on professional armies during this time and artillery experts rather than trusting the knights in shining armor with swords to go fight. They would instead use the new weapons. The power in a region began to move from the lords to the central government that they could afford these expensive gunpowder weapons to defend those who were living in the area. Cannons could be used on land to make significant progress in battle, but they could also be used in the sea to help with battle. Limitations. So, surprise, cannons were not the perfect weapon. As they had their disadvantages, just like many weapons do, they were huge and they were heavy, and this made them hard to move. Ooh, jeepers. They were huge and heavy, and this made them hard to move. It took forever to move them and to reload them, and they misfired a lot. The misfiring made them very dangerous to those who were handling them, just as much as they were to the enemy. Even if those people were trained to man them, they still had the chance to misfire and significantly hurt those who were handling them in battle. Famous battles with cannons. So there are a few famous examples where cannons played a huge role in Europe during the time. At the Battle of Crécy in 1346, which I already mentioned, they were used for the first time, making their debut on the battlefield, really. It was a pivotal moment in the Hundred Year War, as after this, the use of horses in battle was starting to dwindle. They started focusing on long ranged attacks instead to weaken the enemy and then send in forces to go in. The real breakthrough, though, was during the siege of Constantinople in 1453 when the Ottomans used massive bombards to destroy the walls. And it's important because these walls, they had stood over 1,000 years without being broken down by any armies before. And this over here is a painting of the siege by Jean-Le Tavernier. And then another example is the Siege of Rhodes in 1480, which they had already been developing better walls, and this showed in that battle. So, in conclusion, cannons marked the end of the medieval world in many ways. They made castles go away. I mean, they had to change the style of them. They had to be stronger, and they also changed the battle styles that people would use, or in the same way that they had, and this progressed more to different battle styles. And that's it. Thank you.